I am Jimbo Paris, and you are listening to The Jimbo Paris Show. All right, how's it going, everyone? This is Jimbo. Welcome back to the show. And today we have Katarina Polonska. Forgive me if I pronounce that last name wrong, but so she's basically a highly accredited relationship coach, as well as also a mindfulness teacher. So I guess she teaches people sort of about relationships, mental health, those types of things. And I'm going to be interested. Let's get to figure her out some more.
Cool. Yeah. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, my pleasure. How are you doing today?
I am good. I'm calling from a very dark Airbnb basement suite as part of my digital nomad year. So apologies for the bad lighting.
No, it looks fine. It looks
Cool.
fine.
Cool.
To get this started, can you kind of give me a gist of who you are, what you're
Mm-hmm.
about, and what your message is?
Yeah, sure. So I'm a accredited transformation coach specializing in relationships, as you mentioned. And my background's in behavioral science and gender dynamics. So I've spent pretty much my entire life growing up in an Eastern European household, immigrant in England, and studying gender, studying masculinity, femininity, the different interactions between the genders. My father raised me very kind of much focused on this. I grew up with very traditional stereotypes of what it means to be a woman and what my life would look like. And I naturally rebelled against that for a long time. Yeah, throughout my academic life, I went on to do gender studies at Oxford on a scholarship and just really looking at how limited the models of masculinity and femininity that we have in the kind of traditional sense. And then in my behavioral science work, which I was doing more kind of in the corporate space, I was a regional vice president for a consultancy doing organizational development across Canada and the West Coast. That's where I was based. And looking at how do these kind of limited models impact how we show up in our day to day, and how do they get in the way? How do they ultimately sabotage our ability to connect with others? And that eventually led me into becoming a coach. And I started out by working with founders and executives and working on really kind of normal issues, I guess, working on burnout, anxiety, stress. But what I realized after a couple of sessions of working with everyone was that fundamentally it was relationships that were at the heart of everyone's struggle, whether it's a relationship to self or relationship to others. And so that's what led me into becoming a relationship coach.
So, who is it like being an immigrant in Europe? And can you kind of go a bit more in depth on sort of how maybe the relationships you had with your family, maybe in particular your father, may have sort of influenced you into going down this career path?
That's a really good question. No one's asked me about before, but it's it's quite telling. So definitely grew up with very kind of traditional models of what it meant to be a female. So on the one hand, my mum is incredibly successful, ambitious, driven. My dad is ambitious, successful, driven. And fundamentally, that led to the breakdown of their marriage because there were two people who were both really successful, prioritizing their careers, but it eroded the relationship. And now I kind of look at it and I can understand why. It's because they weren't really each other's match in terms of what they viewed the other person to need to be. And so I grew up with this kind of model of, on the one hand, my mom was pushing me to be, go be a feminist, go build your career, go actually build something of your own, go generate your own wealth and be successful. And then my father was kind of telling me that, but also like this message of you don't know what life is unless you're a mother. You don't know what life is unless you're a wife and you're in a relationship. And so I had this kind of very polarizing narrative. And I went to a really amazing girls' school with really incredible, bright women. And I saw the same kind of polarization happening there, that there was this kind of tension of like, do we become really ambitious, driven alpha females, or do we actually need to go find a breadwinner and cool it and stay home and raise a family? And now kind of where I'm at, it's like, you don't have to pick. To an extent you do, sure, but you can still be yourself and still have the kind of relationship where you are allowed to be the full spectrum of who you are as a human being.
That's really fascinating because I'm thinking now when you decided to sort of go down this path and sort of accept these two polarizing sides of yourself really as just one thing. College starts, right? You
Mm-hmm.
graduate high school. What was your mindset sort of going into college? Like, were you always interested in these dynamics of gender, or did these sort of slowly develop more and more? Because you talked a bit about the developmental process to me here, but I'm wondering now, what happens in college? Because
Mm.
college is a big thing. You have parties, you have friends, you have to study. How did you begin to sort of discover yourself even more down that?
Yeah, really good question. So I went into university, my undergrad, already being trained as a coach. I did my first coaching qualification when I was 17, really young. My dad kind of, again, pushed that on me, and I'm very grateful he did. So I actually went in thinking, I don't know if I even need college. I'm going to be an entrepreneur. I'm going to build a business. And I had a tiny little business at uni. But in the end, I got into the academic life. I really enjoyed it. And I didn't start out that interested in the gender dynamics, but as I studied kind of American history, I did like history and literature. As I studied more and more, and then I looked around my kind of the people in my life, and I looked at my father, my brother, my partner at the time, I kept seeing this trend of men, white men, who have ostensibly everything, right? Like very privileged. Like they have a good background, they have a good education, they have all of the options available to them. And I kept seeing what I understand now to be this kind of disenfranchisement, this, I hate to use it, it's kind of like victimhood mentality. And I was frustrated, confused. I didn't understand, like, how is it that you can have everything and still feel like a victim and still complain about your life circumstances, still feel weak and unable to achieve what you want to achieve in society. And so that's what got me looking. I specialized in looking at disenfranchised white American masculinity and being like, why is there so much anger and victimhood here from like the 1980s to the present day? And that's when I understood that masculinity and like neoliberalism, but really that kind of traditional model of what masculinity should be is completely limited. It doesn't really allow for the full humanity of the human experience of expressing emotion, of actually wanting to do more traditionally feminine, quote unquote, things, of actually being nurturing, being caring, being sensitive, being soft. The main vehicle to communicate that kind of emotion, at least back then, I think it is beginning to shift a little bit, but was anger. Like anger or silence. It's kind of retreat and withdraw or get angry. And yeah, and so that's kind of what got me looking at it all and getting more and more fascinated and realizing gender, the kind of traditional gender, is really limited. Like it's not enough.
So, so how did learning these things sort of affect your worldview? You know, going into maybe grad school, maybe you as sort of becoming this teacher, this coach, and sort of
Mm,
maybe now the relationships you have now with the men in your life, because obviously now your lens has sort of changed a bit on
mm.
society as a whole now, and even yourself.
Yeah, it gave me a sense of a common humanity and a sense of, like, even though of course we're different biologically, but at the end of the day we're all human, and everyone ultimately experiences the same emotions even if they're driven by different things. And fundamentally everyone has pretty much the same kind of needs, really. We all want to be loved, we all want to be seen, we all want to be heard, we all want to be safe. And that both humbled me and gave me a lot of compassion. And now when I'm doing the relationship coaching and I work with clients, I see time and time and time again a very, like a, there's a misinformation about what healthy gender dynamics are. So I see women who are, ambitious, driven, successful, and in their minds are like, well, I need an alpha male. I need a very traditionally dominant, strong man because he's going to match me. I don't want someone who's going to be quote unquote weaker than me. And so they go around looking for traditionally alpha men, but that traditionally alpha man is actually very often a manifestation of toxic masculinity, which is not the type of masculinity we want to be working with. And so then there's a disconnect from what they actually want and what they actually need. And I see a lot of tripping up there. So again, there's a lot of kind of re-education around what healthy dynamics look like and ultimately what healthy behavior is, irrespective of your gender. There's a lot of toxic femininity out there too.
After sort of getting out with your Masters of Women's Studies, you sort of go out here. Were you always a coach, during, your college years, or was it after you sort of came out? When did you know that you were ready to be a coach and that your goal was to sort of become this coach?
Yeah, good question. I think like a lot of coaches, it's something I was just doing anyhow, kind of informally. I actually started my career being an entrepreneur in the champagne and fine wine trade. So very different. I started a business out in Spain. I was importing, distributing champagne. And then I moved to the Middle East and I was working and living out of Dubai. And it's in Dubai that I became really passionate about gender dynamics and justice and re-education here, because I saw within Dubai such limited models of what men and women should be and such different hierarchies and biases, and it was very toxic. So at that point I became really passionate about working in the field, and after doing my master's I actually went to work in like humanitarian aid work and philanthropy, working on gender policy. And even there I saw so much, again, like misinformation, and it was very frustrating. I worked for a couple of the big NGOs, just kind of short term. And yeah, it was my disillusionment with philanthropy that led me into behavioral science, working as an organizational kind of consultant for different companies. So based out of Canada, I moved to Canada. I was working with Fortune 500, 100 companies, startups, and helping advise them on their dynamics. My specialization, given the gender background, was diversity, equity, and inclusion. So I kind of specialized and trained further in that field. And again, I really loved working with people in this space. I did find that doing group training and kind of working with groups of people was more limited than doing one-on-one, because it was something so personal and vulnerable and something where there's a lot of resistance and blockers. There's a lot of, again, miseducation and fear around change, that doing group work wasn't getting the results that one-on-one can get. And that's what really began to kind of put this idea in my head that actually one-on-one work is where the magic really happens, at least in this world, in this kind of intimate world. And so I worked for a huge coaching company, like one of the biggest coaching companies in the world. They're a tech unicorn. And I learned a lot there, had really incredible coaches. And actually it was the really incredible coaches who kind of finally sealed the deal for me. After working with them and seeing how much they transformed my life, I realized, okay, this is something I want to do. I'm going to step out of corporate, step out of kind of being that VP role and train as a coach and go into this full time. So it wasn't something I did always. It's kind of slowly chipped away and become something that I've adopted.
So one thing that really, really I found interesting is that you said you study a lot of behavior science, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so from what I'm getting, you're familiar with sort of how attitudes work, how general persuasion strategies work,
Mm-hmm.
things like, central processing,
Mm-hmm.
peripheral processing,
Mm-hmm.
those interesting nuances. And do you think those dynamics of behavior, or the way you sort of study behavior, changed when you went from the more corporate route to now this route, sort of just working with more of the common public? Like sort of the types of people you were working with in terms of behavioral science, because you might be doing things like, I'm just assuming this.
Mm-hmm.
Were you doing more marketing strategies for these types of things, or was
No,
it?
it was more learning and development. So it was like,
Oh,
yeah. So it was like, imagine I'd have a company like I don't know, like an oil company from, northern Canada, and they're 95% white, blue collar men. And they have a real problem with bullying and aggression and like essentially gendered violence. Like the women in the company were traumatized. And my role would be to come in and diagnose the issue and understand what's happening and then build a strategy to address that. And then I would deploy the teams of people, the psychologists who would go and actually do the training and the re-education and the enablement and all of that. So really I was pretty removed. I was a consultant and not working on the ground, if that makes sense.
okay.
Mm-hmm.
So sort of working with those types of groups as a consultant, how did that sort of carry over to, sort of just becoming this social scientist working regularly?
Yeah. So I think the main thing is what I was on the hook for, which was how do you drive behavioral change? So if I'm working with this organization that really need ultimately more D&I, but the budget holder probably doesn't believe in D&I and they don't know why they need it, and my role is to really re-educate them and persuade them that they actually need it. How do you actually create organizational transformation, which is kind of like a macro level of how do you achieve individual transformation? And the biggest kind of thing that I've carried over that I use on a day to day is something called the COM-B model. COM-B model is like a theory of change for behavioral change. So the first step to any behavioral change is to identify the motivation. So what does the person who's changing need to believe or feel in order to be motivated to change? So driving motivation is number one. Number two is what capabilities do they need to have in order to be able to do the change that they're trying to do? So what kind of behaviors do they need to learn? And then step three is what opportunities do they need in their day-to-day to be able to practice the new behavior that they've learned? And so what that looks like is, I use a really simple example, like someone who's trying to lose weight, for example. So first they need the motivation to lose weight. What is driving them on an inner level, not an external level? I mean, it might be external, but internal motivation is a bit stronger. What's driving them to lose weight? It might be health, because actually they have children and they want to be able to play with their children and they want to be like the best parent that they can be. It might be an external goal. They have a wedding to get thin for, whatever their driver is. But getting really clear on that motivation is really important in order to fuel the passion and the energy into doing the change. Then step two is the capabilities. So how do they actually go ahead and lose the weight? That might be re-educating them on exercise, on diet, on whatever kind of blood type they have, whatever it might be, but creating that education and then the capabilities of how do they actually do that on a day-to-day basis. And then step three is the opportunity. So it's all very good and well to have the motivation to lose weight, know how to lose weight, but if you're in an environment that doesn't support that, because maybe you're traveling 24/7 and you don't have access to a kitchen and you can't actually cook your own meals, or maybe you don't have the budget, or maybe your family don't actually enjoy eating healthy, and that's going to get in the way. So step three is how do you create the opportunity to actually practice the new behaviors and integrate them into your day-to-day? And so with these three things, we can drive behavioral change. And that's something I use pretty much every day in my coaching. Mm-hmm.
So it seems almost like you have, an approach and then sort of a bit like a design theory in a way where you kind of execute it. And that's interesting because it reminds me of like a little bit, somewhat of like the elaboration likelihood model, where you sort
Mm-hmm.
of focus on changing a person's logical perception through emotional action.
Mm.
And I think that's kind of an interesting thing because
Mm-hmm.
I think that's what the group work is for. You sort of create a setting
Mm-hmm.
where you could kind of emotionally shift the audience through information, that
Mm-hmm.
sounds authentic, that sounds true through your teachings, and also maybe even through your mindfulness teaching,
Mm-hmm.
which can all help to sort of relax people and emotionally guide them to think in a more logical way. So
Mm-hmm.
that's an interesting thing. Now, your actual approach, in that process you explain, I don't know what that is, but I learned
Mm-hmm.
something new there. But
Mm-hmm.
that also seems quite interesting too. And do you think that the mindfulness coaching sometimes plays a role occasionally to sort of help with this shift with
Mm.
relationships and sort of that change you mentioned?
Yeah, hugely, hugely. So the mindfulness element is really important for helping people connect to their bodies, because the body has a lot of wisdom. Often, again, especially kind of the very high achieving, intelligent driven people, we're very up in our heads and very disconnected from the neck down. And that means that we're kind of caught up in purely logic and we ignore kind of the gut responses, the emotion, the physical side of things. And at the same time, when we think about all the information out there around us, the body is subconsciously taking everything in, right? So the body has a lot of wisdom that we don't necessarily tap into. And so with mindfulness, I help people connect to their bodies and actually connect to their gut instincts, connect to what's coming up for them, and begin to discern what is it that's coming up for them. Is it actually a gut instinct telling them about some potential danger that they might be in, some potential in dating, like red flags that they might rationalize and ignore? That's something I used to do, like rationalize and kind of logically think their way through without really listening to the inner I call it the inner tapping, but like the inner gut instinct. It might be that the body's sending up anxiety or fear, which in society we typically want to ignore anxiety, ignore fear, and kind of dismiss it. But actually, it has a lot of wisdom. And if you really listen to that anxiety and tap into that anxiety and work with that anxiety, we can glean a lot of wisdom about what we might need to look at, what we might need to work on, things that we might not have enough knowledge about, different areas for growth. And so, same thing with fear. Mindfulness helps us work with the body to be able to make more informed decisions and be able to move through things more, I don't want to say empowered, but I guess in a more empowered way, rather than just using our logic and reason, which can be limited.
And then you sort of mentioned kind of helping people to move in a more empowered way. So, what is your definition of sort of empowering your client?
Yeah. So that really comes down to step one. This is what I do in the first month, helping people get out of their own way. So we all self sabotage as part of the human condition. We often trip ourselves up and we don't know what we don't know. So we all have our own blind spots. We all have our own psychological blockers. We all have our own biases. We all have our own limiting beliefs. We all have our own stuff that is living up in our head and replaying and telling the same stories. And until we have someone who can hold up a mirror to actually challenge, to reveal that to us and then challenge it and explore a different way of being or a different way of thinking, then we're going to stay stuck. And that's what I see is happening in relationships is pretty destructive. So it's quite interesting as well, seeing all the different blockers that all of my clients have and the different patterns between them, but also they're very disparate sometimes. So it goes to show that what you believe is ultimately what you want to believe, truly. You can choose to believe whatever you want to believe. So helping them get out of their own way is one of the first things. And then the second thing is helping them get really clear on what they actually need. So I can talk about this for days, but when we're highly intelligent, rational, driven people, we're very good at thinking we know what we want. We're very good at kind of like having a checklist, having our criteria, having our strategy, and having our little KPIs, whatever it might be. And we typically tick them off and then we think we know what we want. But actually, what we need is very different. Or, it might be kind of in the same vein, but it'll have a nuance to it that we might otherwise ignore. And what we really need is coming, again, typically from the core. It's coming from a deeper part of ourselves, from a more primal part of ourselves that we often forget about or we dismiss. And so then when we're building relationships or we're even like picking career decisions, whatever it might be, often we're getting in our own way and then thinking very rationally about what we want. And the two things without the depth and the nuance and a different perspective can take us down a road that we've probably been down before and probably isn't going to get us where we want to get to. Does that make sense?
I'm interested now, sort of, in what are some of your best client success stories? What are some of the clients that really, really help to motivate you that you sort of push out as sort of example?
Yeah. One of my favorite ones is it's a woman who, had previously been engaged and it had all ended and she was devastated and absolutely heartbroken. And then coming from that broken place was very clear that she didn't want to make the same mistake again. And that's something, again, I can relate to. She didn't want to make that same mistake again. And so when we began working together, it was literally within the second week that she had that aha moment of, got it. This is where I've been blocking myself. This is where I've been thinking certain things that have made me get in my own way. And so the unraveling of the unhelpful, essentially like psyche that was keeping her stuck and keeping her repeating the same patterns was very quick. And so we're still working together, but she's probably I shouldn't say probably one of my favorite clients because the aha moments just like keep coming so quickly. And there's very similar stories of, I have one client who was questioning whether he should break up with his partner because he kept kind of flip-flopping from like feeling hot and cold, and he was convinced that it's something about her that's wrong, that actually he needs to walk away. And that's very common as well. People break up relationships almost prematurely because they haven't actually looked deeper within at what's going on inside of them. And so after doing the work, he got the clarity that he needed on what it actually is that he needs to work on, as opposed to just terminating the relationship.
So what you're saying here is that it's crucial to sort of have good self-perception as well.
Mm-hmm.
So you see, that sounds interesting because even though a lot of times you do sound like a coach, I sometimes feel like, a lot of these relationship coaches can occasionally veer into the routes of therapists as well. Would you say that's also something that's true?
To an extent, yeah. The difference is that therapy will typically stay in the past, keep looking at the past, and keep circling back to it. I've had therapy for like 15 years, and I never had any therapy that gave me clear present moment direction and strategy. And that's something I'm really passionate about. So when it comes to coaching, it really is like, okay, well, what do you know from your past? And let's do a little bit of work there. But really, we're bringing that information to the present, making our peace with it, solving for it, and then building a strategy forward. It's very kind of outcome orientated.
So I'm thinking here, what is the future of your business? What is the future of your brand? And sort of, what would you be interested in doing? Maybe starting a podcast, writing a book, or maybe you already have books, write some more books. What's the plan with that?
So right now I'm focusing on, I have a 12-week program, a 12-week system to take people from essentially not knowing where they're going wrong, and people, it's single people who are dating around and they have everything in their life figured out. They've got their home, they have their career, they have their family, they have their friends, but they cannot figure out what's going on in their relationships. And they might be going on dates and having fun, but they're kind of like nothing's clicking and they don't know why. And they don't have time to waste. So I have this 12-week program, which is super comprehensive, and it takes them really from kind of point A to the finish line of getting complete laser clear clarity on where they're going wrong, how to stop self-sabotaging, how to get out of their own way, get laser clear on what they want and need, understand masculinity, femininity, and how that's showing up in their lives and might be holding them back, understand attachment styles, understand the science of dating, and actually what are the psychological blockers that we have on a day-to-day basis when we're out there and we're single, how to overcome those, and then how to actually build a strategy and a life going forward that really allows them to attract the ultimate match without making it like a horrible, pressuring, stressful experience. And so that's the focus for now, building that. And by building that, I mean kind of getting more and more traction, more and more people through. And then, I don't know, once I have, say, 1,000 people through that, I'd love to write a book. Would love to write a book and actually make this a very formal system. I keep saying I'm going to do a PhD. Probably don't need a PhD. That's my own inner academic, but would love to do that at some point and formalize the process.
So you would be interested in a book. Would that book be more of an autobiography with maybe a few good insights to sort of your teachings, or would it be just more of an academically inclined book, just focused on information, or more of a self-help book on a more basic level, just trying to teach people?
Yeah, I think it'd probably be more self-help. That's what I've grown up with. I think I've read all of them at this point.
All right. Well, this has been an excellent interview, and I definitely learned a lot from you. Hopefully you enjoyed this as well.
Yeah, thank you.
So yeah, are there any final words you can say to the audience, and sort of how can they all reach you?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So huge shout out to anyone who is single and tired of trying to figure it out. Like, get in touch with me, I can help. Email is info@katarinapolonska.com. I'm sure you'll have the spelling in your show notes because my surname is tricky, but you pronounced it well. Or go on my website, www.katarinapolonska.com. You can also find me on LinkedIn.
Okay. Thank you for watching the Jimbo Paris Show. I'll see you next time. I'm currently working on a passion project that I'm really excited about, but I need your help to bring it to life. We'll be launching soon our very own Jimbo Paris Academy, and this is going to be about aspiring creators and creating concepts. Thank you for your support. I'm sharing free bonus content to supporters, so let's make some amazing content together. Our affiliate partner, LifeWork Systems, focused on helping create a better collegial environment, looking at the mental health of business workers, business employees, and overall bringing the business up. Thank you for listening to the Jimbo Paris Show.